Welcome to the most dangerous planet in the universe, where everything is trying to kill you.
I need a hand.
You're here to prove yourself. Hunting something that can't be killed. We might not be alone in this hunt.
Yaslan zor icet. Det jet yul naichish.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cinemancuso, and this is Review Roundup. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the latest and sometimes greatest films coming to a cinema near you. Today we are talking about Predator Badlands, directed by Dan Trachtenberg, cast out from his clan. A young predator finds an unlikely ally in a damaged android and embarks on a treacherous journey in search of the ultimate adversary. But before we go any further, if you haven't yet, please like this video. It really helps with engagement in the algorithm and people finding the channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? This way you never miss reviews like this. This is going to be mainly a pseudo spoiler review, but we can and will get into full spoilers at the end so I can read out any of your questions and comments. So to that end, leave questions and comments, right? If you're watching this live, first of all, welcome. Let me know where you're watching from. Second of all, conversations like this are always going to be more interesting when we can have a dialogue. So as I'm kind of going through my own thoughts, let me know what you think. And unless it's something like offensive, I will read every comment and question from the live chat. If you're watching this after the fact, we're still super happy to have you. By the time you're watching this, there should be time codes in the description so you can kind of jump around at your leisure. And you should definitely subscribe so that way you can join us live next time. So starting kind of bird's eye view as I want to do here, Trachtenberg and screenwriter Patrick Azan, if that's how you say it, Azan? I'm not quite sure. They've taken up a very noble and interesting endeavor in trying to center and humanize the Yacha, aka the predators, right? That's their species, right? And interestingly enough, I didn't know this, because full spoilers, or full disclosure, I should say, I've only ever seen the original Predator, and then I watched Prey. The previous Dan Trachtenberg live-action Predator movie that came out, a Hulu exclusive in 2022 during kind of like near the tail end of COVID. So some of this is going to kind of be filtered by that. I'm not like this huge Predator fan, and I don't necessarily I haven't seen all these movies, right? So I was surprised or interested to learn that this term of their species, the Yacha, actually originated from a spin-off novel. And it's only fitting that this is the first time that it's being used in the actual films, because it's the first story to ever really care about these creatures enough for us to actually even know their name, right? And because this species has always been depicted, or again, at least in the films that I've seen, as irredeemable monsters, right? Who are motivated solely by bloodlust. So what this film kind of does, or at least tries to do, is raise the question, what kind of society would breed such contemptible creatures, right? As we learn at the beginning of the film, their world is one not built on love or trust or care for others, even those close to you. It's based on strength, right? And our hero, Dek, D-E-K, right? He's the runt of the family, even though he's like 7 feet tall, the character, like 7'3". He's the runt, right? And his father, wants to cull him and his weakness. Apparently he tasked his brother with killing him, and then when his brother refused, his father killed the brother and then tried to kill Dek, but then Dek was able to escape, right? So there's this central idea that the film seems to be wrestling with, however trite the idea might be, that Dek, that the tension is between living up to the expectations and standards of your society or culture, and following your own path, right? You know, if the Yacha are merciless killers who idolize individual survival, like it's seen as a weakness to rely on others, then by contrast, Deck will, you know, by the end of the story, Deck will prioritize interpersonal relationships and use his strength to protect those that he cares about. Like there's this analogy kind of given about the wolf, right? And the alpha male is not the one who kills the most, but the one who protects the most, right? But I will say that these ideas, however interesting, are somewhat muddied by the fact that, you know, spoiler alert, at the end, Deck returns to his home planet and kills his father at the end. And, you know, the suggestion seems to kind of be, you know, wanton violence is fine as long as it's directed at the right people, right? And, you know, full disclosure, I mean, I'm like a radical pacifist, right? So, but even if you take that bias out of it, it feels like the film isn't really trying to say that, right? Because, like, what's Deck's culminating critical choice is, like, saving Bud, who's like this little monkey character who is actually, spoiler alert, is like the child baby version of the monster that he has come here to kill, the Kalisk. You know, his ultimately, obviously he has to kill the other Elle Fanning android, right? Because there's two of them, and they're both played by Elle Fanning. Obviously he has to kill her to do that, but it seems like the primary kind of culminating critical choice is that he is choosing to come back, even though he was on his ship and could have easily just flown away and done something else. He goes back and puts himself in harm's way to rescue Bud's mother. Bud being like this little monkey creature. You know, so the film doesn't, so it's, forget my kind of radical pacifist bias. It feels like the film doesn't really line up with the ending, right? And I think that the film would have been more powerful had Deck let his father live. Not solely just like out of mercy, but specifically so that his father would have to live with his defeat at the hands of the Runt, right? And chances are he probably wouldn't change, but this idea that, you know, you're giving him the opportunity to change, right? And live his life knowing he was defeated by the weakest link. And what does that mean, right? And perhaps that would lead to some kind of transformation or conversion for the father. But, you know, the film doesn't really do that. And not only does the ending fall a bit short, so too does the story as a whole, right? You know, there's nothing here on a narrative level that's particularly novel or interesting, right? Like the idea that I just spent a couple minutes describing is not a new idea by any means. But you know, that being said, there's only so many stories you can tell. It's all about how you tell it. But I would argue that even the execution doesn't really elevate the ideas or the story setup. You know, perhaps the subversion of our expectations of the Predators is meant to do most of the heavy lifting here in terms of the novelty. But again, like I've mentioned, I don't really have a strong enough familiarity with or any real fondness for this franchise. So the subversion is interesting, but it's nothing earth-shattering. Like I'm not like, oh, what? A Predator who has like a character arc and three-dimensionality and like okay, like on an intellectual level I understand how that's new, but it doesn't really matter to me, right? And while a lot is going on in the story, or at least like on screen, nothing meaningful seems to really be happening. And as a result, the pacing of this, you know, 107-minute film, you know, it's not even that long. I remember seeing the runtime and being like, oh, like this is kind of mercifully short. The pacing did feel a little sluggish at times. Like I was checking my watch several times. I think that's a good indicator of how I feel about a movie is like, how often am I checking my watch, right? But not that any amount is bad, because sometimes I'll check my watch in an amazing movie just to be like, please tell me there's still a lot more left, right? And that's like one of the best feelings when you think you're near the end of the movie and you're like, shit, there's still like another hour and a half of this. This is phenomenal. But that was not the case for this movie. I was checking my watch probably at least 3 or 4 times during the runtime. And I'm not really sure like what comment to make about this, but I just feel like it's worth noting that, again, pseudo spoilers here. I'm not sure if this was revealed in the trailers. It's worth noting that this film is technically another crossover with the Alien franchise, right? Of course, the Predator and the Xenomorph have clashed in the Alien vs. Predator sub-series. I think there was like 2 of those crossover movies, along with some comics and novels. But to my knowledge, this is the first film in either franchise that is like strictly of its own franchise. Like it's not billed as a crossover, yet contains elements from the other. And the big thing here is Elle Fanning's character, Thea, who's a synthetic synthetic android made by the Weyland-Yutani Corporation, that's featured in the Alien franchise, right? So like Ian Holmes' character in the original Alien and Michael Fassbender's characters in the prequels, right? And both franchises were owned by 20th Century Fox, now 20th Century Studios. So could Disney be building up to a new crossover between them? Because we did just get Alien Covenant a couple years ago, which was like one of my favorite movies of that year. So are they building up to a crossover? Disney's like, we spent all this money on Fox. Aside from Avatar, are there really any huge franchises? And I would probably argue, I'm sure if I thought a little bit harder, I could probably think of more that might be ahead of this. But these are like Alien and Predator are really big franchises that those were big gets, right, in terms of IP when Disney bought 20th Century Fox. But what makes films in the Alien franchise and then this franchise work are the characters, right? Or at least the films that are the best in those franchises are often because of the characters. But this film wants for better characters than it has, right? Keeping in line with kind of the conventionality of the narrative deck, has a very familiar but certainly still functional character arc. He begins the film with like this false goal of proving his father wrong, that he's not the weakest link, and by doing so is implicitly kind of reaffirming the value of his culture's, the value of the culture's values, in a sense, to put it as, I was trying to think of a better way to phrase that, right? And over the course of the story, he learns to chart his own path, right? We've treaded this ground before. But not only is it conventional, but unfortunately it's really hard to connect with this character because visually he's just so foreign to us, right? Obviously he's still humanoid, but any performance given by the actor, Demetrius Schuster, I'm gonna totally butcher this, Koloa Matangi or Katangi, he's a New Zealand actor. Any performance that he is giving, other than just being like a huge body double, it's any performance that he's giving is just buried under heavy CGI, as well as like a gruff, heavily processed alien language, right? Heavily processed in terms of like the audio, right? And it also doesn't help that Dex Species was designed for the original 1987 Predator film to be as grotesque and horrifying as possible, right? So that's like a built-in unsolvable obstacle when making a film with this premise of like, we're going to center the Predator. Like maybe they should have kind of pulled the Mandalorian, right? Where he mostly has his helmet on. Maybe that would have, helped us empathize with him a little bit more. And I'm not trying to be superficial, but I think there's something really fundamental about human psychology. That it's not that he doesn't look human, right? Because we can anthropomorphize like a water bottle, right? Like that's not the issue. The issue is that he's so actively negatively visually appealing, right? The exception being his eyes, right? And I don't know if you were watching this review and you watching this live and you saw like the little trailer preview that I put up. Like there's this moment in the film that they put in the trailer, and I saw it in the theater being like, it made me lean in and go, oh, this was interesting. I found the film not as emotionally interesting as this. When Deck like first lands on this like foreign planet, I think it's called Gehenna or Gehenna or something. You see like this range of emotions come over his face. It's all like in the eyes and like literally like the muscles above the bone and muscles above the eyes. You see like the range of like the distraught, sad, confused, angry, resilient. Like you get like this whole range of emotions in this little moment. And it's moments of kind of three-dimensional humanity. Human just being in this case just like a person with a soul, right? And like a personality and sapience and agency. You get like these little glimmers of humanity, previously unseen from the species in any of the films. Again, I could be some book or comic or spin-off movie may have done this, but this is again my first, as far as I'm aware, this is the first real time that we're really giving anybody from this species any chance to like be fundamentally like a three-dimensional character, right? To counteract the problems, right? The fundamental problems with making you the Predator your main character, like I said, he doesn't speak English. They've introduced Elle Fanning as the synthetic android named Thea, right? As well as like her sister, quote unquote, Tessa, but primarily Thea is like the one we like and root for and care about. And her inclusion obviously provides a mechanism to have someone in our core cast speaking English, right? And they kind of, you do like the hand waving answer, like the always convenient, which is always the old reliable universal translator trick. So it's like she's speaking, English for us, but diegetically she's speaking whatever language he is speaking, right? And part of me, maybe they just didn't want to have to try to do the mouth movements for Deck, but they still do it because he still talks, right? Like for Prey, Dan Trachtenberg's previous film in this franchise takes place in like the early 18th century, following the Comanche people in like the Western United States, and they all speak English, right? Except for like some keywords, right? And it's like obviously they're not speaking English diegetically, but it's for us, right? And maybe this film would have done a little bit better had we gotten him. But again, I'm really impressed by the bold choice to have him not speak any English. But again, basically you've added in Elle Fanning as like an antidote to a problem you created, right? And no shade to Fanning, but I'm sorry, and this is not, I'm not super in tune with this, but apparently there's been a lot of complaints about this movie, like they made the Predator woke, and they like have this female character or whatever. I am not criticizing her from that angle at all. She was just insufferable in this movie, frankly. Her interjections always felt so clumsy and obvious from like a screenwriting perspective of like why she was in it, why she was saying anything that she was ever saying. And I suppose on some level, in addition to having like some injection of English within the core cast, I suppose her purpose, they purpose her into some kind of comedic relief, but A, it's not particularly funny. It's usually just annoying. And then B, though, it introduces a tonal problem for a film that was, until her introduction into the film, the film was fairly self-serious. So it just creates like this weird kind of tonal tension. And her performance is just so over the top that it almost felt like a conscious directorial choice. So again, no shade to her. Probably boils down maybe to some of the direction here. But, the best thing that the character has going for her is the way that her arc parallels that of Deck, right? Where both characters have to, rise above the expectations, whether they're socially imposed or self-imposed, these expectations that define their sense of purpose and that define their sense of selfhood, right? And what their reason for existing even is, right? But all of this said, Trachtenberg, for all of this film's faults, is an interesting director to be sure, right? Whether it's 10 Cloverfield Lane or Prey, he finds a way to push against the expectations of the franchise that he's working in. Like 10 Cloverfield Lane, for example, while, famously was not originally conceived as part of that franchise. I don't know how far they got into the production, but I think I remember once heard, like, they already filmed the movie and they shot it and they were editing it, and then they decided, let's make this kind of a Cloverfield spinoff of some kind. And then they did like some reshoots to add like a little bit of the ending, right? So that's like a weird case, but even still, it's still a Cloverfield movie. And nonetheless, it's a complete genre switch from like the found footage horror genre that was kind of super prevalent in like the 2000s. And then, of course, Prey, like I mentioned before, the last big Predator movie, centered on a Native American and a woman, no less, as the protagonist, limiting, and that was really novel because her means of defending against and attacking the Predator are limited to that of what was available in the early 18th century, northern Great Plains of North America, in like, I think the movie takes place like in 1719 or something, right? So Trachtenberg has this kind of record of like taking an existing thing and kind of experimenting within it, right? And similarly here, like I mentioned before, it is a bold choice to have your main character never speak English, and furthermore have zero English spoken by anybody for like the first little chunk of the movie, maybe like 20 minutes. And it was, probably for the best, but I was wondering how things would have been had Deck been alone the entire film and therefore had no English, whatever, right? Really just focus on this journey. Even if he were to talk to someone and there would be the subtitles, the film would have been forced to employ more visual storytelling. And I think people get confused what visual storytelling really means. It is not just a film that has little or no dialogue, right? Visual storytelling is exactly, it's telling a story through the visuals. And what that means is, you can have a film with a lot of dialogue that also has a lot of visual storytelling. So, even if it's a dialogue heavy scene, the way you edit and shoot a scene reveals something about the characters, right? It's the same way, like, you could have the same events happen in a book, but the way it's written kind of gives you a different impression or takeaway or feeling from those events. And, unfortunately, again, maybe it's for the best because, this film, the way, assuming assuming the only difference would be that he's alone and it'd be more visual storytelling and there's no English, but everything else being equal, then it's probably for the best because the visuals are just not really great, right? They're one of the weakest aspects of the film. They're gray, they're muddy, they're dizzying, and I'll kind of go through each one of these here. So like the color correction, I'm not an expert on color theory or color correction, right? But I at least have a basic binary. Do I like looking at it or do I not like looking at it? And the color correction here suffers from our modern blockbuster conundrum, right? This aversion to vibrancy and legibility. Part of me, I think it has to do with sloppy digital filmmaking coupled with sloppy VFX work, like a lot of green screen work. So you're kind of limited to like what kind of color palette you can have. Speaking of the VFX, right, that the VFX work is really hit or miss. So action sequences with heavy CGI work tend to blur, right? It becomes very blurry. Apparently, it also doesn't help, poorly storyboarded action sequences, none of which, even on their face, are particularly inventive or memorable. They're not, because it's blurry and gray and it's not very legible. It's not really well suited for an IMAX screen. When I reviewed Tron Ares a couple weeks ago, I talked about, maybe I'm giving this film higher marks than I should, but something about the IMAX experience really elevated it. This movie proves that just because it's an IMAX doesn't mean it's gonna get brownie points from me, at least, right? Because that film really captured the scope that IMAX provides. The color was astounding, the sound design. Whereas this was just kind of dizzying visually and aurally. Like this, it was not necessarily a super clean, refined experience. Which is a shame because you could tell that the people making the film have some kind of passion behind it. So now it's time for the Q&A, some questions and comments, but hold on. There's no questions and comments. If you're watching this, leave comments and questions about what you thought of the movie, Like I mentioned earlier, the reason why I do these live is that because there's always the chance someone will leave a question or comment. It's always more interesting when we can have a dialogue because, you guys will make me think of something that I hadn't thought of before, make me think of something that I did think about but I forgot to add in or think about it in a different way. So, if you're watching, feel free to put some comments and questions in the live chat. Again, unless it's like offensive, I will read it in response to it. But if you are watching, you want to put something, kind of try to squeak that in now. I guess I'll just kind of move on here to my final thoughts and then I'll see if there's any more questions or comments. But, overall, I think Predator Badlands gets a lot of brownie points for trying to kind of think outside the box and kind of push the boundaries of what we would expect from this franchise. I'm just not sure if it really sticks the landing. Its bold elements are far and few between, and they're not really enough. They're not bold enough. Again, like I mentioned before, maybe I would care more if I was really into this franchise. But the fact that we get to kind of follow a Predator, for me, almost feels like, we've never done that before, right? Like it isn't as novel or impressive as I think the film maybe is hoping or trying to just say it is. So, in terms of my rating, I'm gonna give this a 6 out of 10. I thought it was a net positive. I thought it was okay, but it's just really missing that secret sauce. I think, again, there's just some of the issues of this film are fixable. Right, that had the script been written differently or shot differently or edited differently, from every stage of production, pre-production, production, post-production, there are things that are wrong with this movie that could have been done differently. But then some of the problems are just innate with the concept, right? Primarily the fact that we have this character, that is so foreign to us and literally was designed 30 or 40 years ago to push us away from it. It's, you're already you're already off to a bad start, or you're already working on negative points, right? So, that's kind of my read of this. Again, I'm always happy to see someone thinking outside the box with some of these, but it doesn't, just because you're doing something new doesn't automatically make it good, right? Viviana, thank you so much, Viviana, for squeezing in one last little comment here. What do you think is next for the franchise? I don't know. I mean, again, it's hard for me to even say since I don't have like an encyclopedic knowledge of the franchise. Because I would say, with counting the Alien versus Predator movies, I think this is like the 8th Predator movie or something like that. So, it's hard for me to even give like a compelling answer to this question, considering like I don't know everything that has been done. But I feel like, at least like from a pure business standpoint, I would be shocked if Disney is not trying to gear up to do some kind of crossover again with Alien. Because they did Alien Covenant a couple years ago. They had that other show, what was it, Alien Earth, which I heard a lot about. I don't know if it was good or if people liked it, but you know, it's clear that Disney, I mean, obviously it's 20th Century Studios, but again, Disney is the one calling the shots here. It's obvious they want to try to keep these franchises alive in some way. And the inclusion of Weyland Yutani, the corporation from Alien, in this movie, in like a central kind of fat role, does not feel like an Easter egg. That feels like they are laying the groundwork and getting audiences ready for some kind of crossover event. Especially considering that their Marvel crossover stuff is really floundering, right? And then it still remains to be seen once the new Avengers movie comes out. I think it's like next summer, maybe? You know, the film with like 80 people in it, and no one knows what the film's even about because they just come in and stand in front of a green screen and say their lines, and it's all going to be kind of put together in post. Like, so who knows? But I'm not sure what's next for the franchise, but I think I would not be surprised if within the next 5 years we get a new Alien versus Predator movie. But yeah, that's the only other comment that I see here. So I think we just gotta wrap things up here, unfortunately, or fortunately, if you hate watching this, but then why are you watching it, right? That's it for this installment of Review Roundup. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please like this video. It really, really helps. Like, you can't even imagine how much it helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding this channel. And since you found the channel, why not subscribe? And this way, you never miss a video. And don't forget to comment below and let me know what you think of Predator Badlands. Until next time, peace out.